The sound of my sister Rebecca's voice echoing through the courthouse hallway hit me like ice water. She was laughing, actually laughing, as she spoke into her phone about how much easier everything would be now that I was finally gone. I pressed myself against the marble pillar, my hospital discharge papers still crumpled in my trembling hand, and listened to her destroy what was left of my faith in family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The death certificate came through this morning, she said, her tone light and cheerful like she was discussing weekend plans. The lawyer says we can proceed with the estate division next Tuesday. Finally, we can get our hands on what should have been ours all along. My name is Marilyn Edwards, and 3 months ago, I was declared legally dead while lying unconscious in a trauma ward 2,000 miles away from home. What my family didn't know was that I had survived the car accident that nearly claimed my life. What they also didn't know was that I could hear every word they were saying as they planned to carve up my life's work like vultures picking at roadkill. The accident happened on a rainy October evening in Colorado, where I had been attending a business conference for my consulting firm. I had built Edwards Strategic Solutions from nothing, working 16-hour days for 15 years, until it became one of the most respected management consulting companies in the Pacific Northwest. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was driving to the airport after closing a deal that would secure my retirement when a drunk driver ran a red light and sent my rental car spinning into a concrete barrier. When I woke up 6 weeks later, I had no identification, no memory of my name, and a face so swollen and bandaged that even I wouldn't have recognized myself in a mirror. The nurses called me Jane Doe and spoke in hushed tones about how lucky I was to be alive. They said I had been found without a purse, that my car had been so mangled they couldn't recover anything useful, and that no one had reported me missing. That last part should have surprised me, but it didn't. My parents had died when I was 25, and I had never married or had children. My entire family consisted of my younger sister Rebecca and my half-brother Marcus, both of whom I had financially supported through college, graduate school, and various failed business ventures over the years. We weren't close, but I had always assumed that blood meant something, that they would at least notice if I disappeared from the face of the earth. I was wrong. The memory came back to me gradually, piece by piece, like a puzzle reassembling itself in my brain. First my name, then my address, then the growing realization that I had been missing for over a month, and nobody had bothered to look for me. When I finally convinced the hospital social worker to make some calls, we discovered that Rebecca had already filed a missing person report, had it converted to a presumed death case, and was in the process of having me declared legally deceased. The social worker, a kind woman named Patricia, who had dealt with worse family situations than mine, explained that this wasn't uncommon when someone disappeared without a trace and had significant assets. She helped me contact a lawyer in Seattle who specialized in cases like mine, and that's when I learned just how quickly my loving siblings had moved to erase me from existence. Rebecca had wasted no time in petitioning the court, claiming that my extended absence and lack of contact was completely out of character, that I would never leave my business unattended, and that the only logical explanation was that something terrible had happened to me. She painted herself as the grieving sister who had exhausted every possible avenue to find me before reluctantly accepting that I must be dead. What she failed to mention to the court was that she had never actually tried to find me. She hadn't called the police in Colorado. She hadn't contacted any hospitals. She hadn't even bothered to call my office to see if anyone there knew where I had gone. She had simply waited exactly the minimum amount of time required by law and then filed the paperwork to have me declared dead. The lawyer, James Morrison, explained that Rebecca and Marcus had moved remarkably fast to begin the probate process. They had already submitted my will, which left everything equally divided between them, and had scheduled the final hearing for the following Tuesday. In just 5 days, they would legally inherit my company, my house, my investment portfolio, and every dollar I had worked my entire adult life to accumulate. The worst part wasn't even the money, though losing 15 years of building a business certainly stung. The worst part was reading the victim impact statements they had submitted to the court, weeping about how devastated they were by my loss, how much they had loved me, how they would treasure my memory forever. Rebecca had written 3 pages about our childhood bond and how she would dedicate her life to honoring my legacy. Marcus had submitted a shorter statement, but no less dramatic, about how losing his big sister had left a hole in his heart that would never heal. It was all complete fiction. Rebecca and I had barely spoken in the past 5 years, ever since I had refused to loan her money for another one of her get-rich-quick schemes. She had wanted to open a boutique clothing store despite having no experience in retail and no business plan beyond selling cute clothes to my friends. When I suggested she might want to start smaller or get some training first, she accused me of being jealous of her creativity and trying to hold her back. The conversation had ended with her screaming that I was a selfish control freak who used money to manipulate people, and we hadn't had a real conversation since. Marcus wasn't much better. He was 8 years younger than me and had spent most of his adult life drifting between half-hearted career attempts and expecting me to fund his lifestyle. He had tried being a musician, a photographer, a personal trainer, and most recently a cryptocurrency day trader, none of which had generated enough income to pay his rent. Every few months he would call with some sob story about unexpected expenses or promising investment opportunities, and like an idiot, I had always bailed him out. I had told myself I was being a good big sister, helping them find their way in the world. The truth was probably closer to what Rebecca had accused me of. I had used money to maintain some kind of connection with them, because I didn't know how else to be part of their lives. I had bought their tolerance for my lectures about responsibility and financial planning. I had purchased the illusion that we were still a family, even though none of us particularly liked spending time together. Now I was lying in a hospital bed in Denver, watching the news coverage of my own memorial service on a laptop James had brought me. The camera panned across a small crowd of people I recognized from my office and a few neighbors I barely knew. Rebecca stood at the podium wearing an elegant black dress I was certain she couldn't afford, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she spoke about the sister she had lost too soon. She talked about how generous I had been, how I had always put family first, how I had sacrificed my own happiness to make sure she and Marcus had every opportunity to succeed. She talked about my dedication to my work and my quiet acts of charity that nobody knew about. She painted a picture of a saint, a devoted sister who had loved unconditionally and given endlessly without expecting anything in return. None of it was true, but it sounded beautiful. For a moment I almost wished I could have been the person she was describing. I almost felt sorry for the grieving woman at the podium who had lost such a wonderful sister. Then she looked directly into the camera, her eyes dry despite the tissue in her hand, and I saw something that made my stomach turn over. Relief. She wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. She was performing grief for the cameras and the lawyers, and anyone else who might question how quickly she had moved to claim my estate. But underneath the black dress and the carefully practiced expressions of sorrow, she looked like someone who had just won the lottery. Marcus gave a shorter speech about how much he would miss our Sunday phone calls, which was particularly creative since we hadn't had a Sunday phone call in over 2 years. He talked about how I had been his role model, his inspiration to work hard and build something meaningful. He mentioned the business advice I had given him and how he planned to use the lessons I had taught him to honor my memory. That was when I knew for certain that this wasn't just about money, this was about rewriting history. They weren't just stealing my assets, they were stealing my story. They were turning me into the sister they had wanted me to be, instead of the complicated, sometimes difficult person I actually was. They were creating a version of our relationship that painted them as the loving family members who had been blessed by my generosity, instead of the entitled adults who had treated me like a personal ATM for most of their lives. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to process what I had just witnessed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Patricia came by during her evening rounds and found me sitting in the dark, still holding the discharge papers that would finally let me leave this place. "How are you feeling about going home?" she asked, settling into the chair beside my bed. I looked at her for a moment, this stranger who had shown me more genuine concern in the past week than my own family had in years. "I don't think I have a home to go back to," I said finally. She nodded like she understood. "What are you thinking of doing?" I had been asking myself that same question for hours. I could call James and have him file an emergency motion to stop the probate hearing. I could present myself to the court and reclaim my life and my assets. I could walk back into my old existence like nothing had happened and pretend that discovering my family's true feelings about me hadn't changed everything. Or I could do something else entirely. I'm thinking about attending my own funeral, I said. Patricia raised an eyebrow but didn't look shocked. I got the impression that she had heard stranger things in her line of work. That sounds like it could be complicated. It's going to be very complicated, I agreed. But I think it might also be necessary. She was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? What do you hope to accomplish? It was a fair question, and I wasn't entirely sure I had a good answer. Part of me wanted revenge, wanted to see the looks on their faces when their dead sister walked into that courtroom. Part of me wanted justice, wanted to reclaim what was mine and make sure they couldn't profit from my supposed death. But there was something else, something deeper that I was still trying to understand. I want them to see me, I said finally. Really see me. Not the version of me they've created in their heads. Not the ATM they can manipulate when they need money. Not the convenient family member they can mourn when it suits their purposes. I want them to see exactly who I am and what they've done. Patricia nodded slowly. And then what? Then I'll decide what kind of family we're going to be going forward, if we're going to be a family at all. The next morning, I checked myself out of the hospital and took a taxi to the airport. James had arranged for temporary identification documents that would allow me to travel, and I had enough cash in my wallet from the conference to buy a plane ticket home. As the plane lifted off from Denver, I looked down at the city where I had been reborn, where I had learned the truth about the people I had thought loved me, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I had no obligations to anyone, no business meetings to attend, no family members to support, no expectations to meet. Rebecca and Marcus thought I was dead, which meant I could observe them without the burden of their performance. I could see who they really were when they thought no one was watching. The plane touched down in Seattle just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I had fallen in love with this city in the first place. I took a cab to a small hotel downtown, checked in under the name on my temporary ID, and spent the evening walking through the neighborhoods where I had spent the last 15 years building a life that apparently meant nothing to the people who were supposed to matter most. I walked past my office building, where the lights were still on in several windows. I wondered if my employees were working late to keep the company running in my absence, or if Rebecca and Marcus had already started making changes. I walked past my house, where I could see cars in the driveway and lights on in every room. It looked like someone was having a party. The next day, I did something I had never done before in my entire adult life. I did absolutely nothing. I ordered room service, watched television, and tried to remember what it felt like to exist without a schedule or a goal or a list of people depending on me. It was surprisingly difficult. Every few hours, I would reach for my phone to check emails that were no longer mine to read or return calls that were no longer mine to answer. By the third day, I was going stir-crazy. I walked to the downtown library and spent hours researching everything I could find about posthumous legal proceedings, estate law, and cases of people who had been wrongly declared dead. I learned that what had happened to me was more common than I had realized, particularly in cases where someone disappeared without immediate family or close friends to advocate for them. I also learned that legally, I was in a very strong position. I was obviously not dead, which meant that any proceedings based on my death were automatically invalid. The challenge would be proving my identity and establishing that I had not deliberately staged my disappearance for fraudulent purposes. James had already begun preparing the documentation that would be necessary, but he had warned me that the process could take months and that Rebecca and Marcus would almost certainly challenge every aspect of my claim. That was fine. I had months. For the first time in years, I had nothing but time. On the fourth day, I decided to visit my office. Not to reclaim it, not yet, but to see what was happening to the company I had spent 15 years building. I dressed in clothes I had bought at a thrift store, pulled my hair back under a baseball cap, and walked into the lobby like any other visitor. The receptionist, Sarah, didn't recognize me. That wasn't entirely surprising, given that my face was still healing from the accident, and I looked nothing like the polished professional who had left for Colorado 3 months earlier. I told her I was a potential client interested in learning more about the company's services, and she directed me to wait in the reception area while she found someone to speak with me. 20 minutes later, Marcus appeared in the lobby wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He introduced himself as the interim managing director and invited me to his office to discuss my needs. His office. The office that used to be mine, with my desk and my chairs and my diplomas on the wall. He spent 45 minutes trying to sell me consulting services for a fictional restaurant chain I claimed to be opening. He was smooth and professional, I had to give him that. He had obviously been practicing. He knew enough about the business to sound credible, and he had clearly spent time memorizing the talking points I had developed over the years. But he had no idea what he was actually selling. When I asked detailed questions about implementation timelines and measurement strategies, he gave me vague answers about customized solutions and collaborative approaches. When I pressed him for case studies or examples of similar work the company had done, he deflected by talking about confidentiality agreements and proprietary methodologies. It was like watching someone perform a play in a language they didn't understand. He had memorized the lines, but he had no comprehension of what they meant. I left the meeting with a business card and a promise that he would have his team put together a proposal for my project. Walking out of that building, I felt a mixture of rage and grief that surprised me with its intensity. This wasn't just about money or assets or legal proceedings. This was about watching someone wear my life like an ill-fitting costume, reducing 15 years of expertise and relationship building to a series of buzzwords and empty promises. That evening, I called James and told him I wanted to move forward with the plan we had discussed. Tuesday morning, Rebecca and Marcus would gather in a conference room with their lawyers and a probate judge to finalize the division of my estate, and I would be there to remind them that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated. James cautioned me again about the risks. Appearing unannounced at a legal proceeding could backfire, especially if Rebecca and Marcus were prepared to argue that I had deliberately disappeared and faked my death for some unknown reason. He recommended that we file the proper motions and schedule a formal hearing where I could present my case in a controlled environment. But I didn't want a controlled environment. I wanted the truth, raw and unfiltered. I wanted to see their faces when their carefully constructed narrative collapsed around them. I wanted them to have to explain to a judge why they had been so eager to declare me dead and divide up my assets without ever actually looking for me. More than anything, I wanted to finally stop being the family member who made things easy for everyone else. I had spent my entire adult life smoothing over conflicts, writing checks to solve problems, and pretending that dysfunction was normal because it was familiar. I had enabled their selfishness by refusing to set boundaries, and I had convinced myself that this was what love looked like. Now I knew better. Love didn't look like grief performed for an inheritance. Love didn't look like relief disguised as mourning. Love didn't look like erasing someone from existence the moment it became financially convenient. On Monday evening, I sat in my hotel room and wrote letters that I would probably never send. I wrote to Rebecca, trying to explain how it felt to discover that the sister I had supported and protected for 30 years had been counting the days until she could profit from my death. I wrote to Marcus, asking him why he thought he deserved to inherit a business he had never shown any interest in understanding. I wrote to myself, apologizing for all the years I had confused enabling with caring, for all the times I had accepted disrespect because it was easier than confrontation, for all the ways I had failed to insist on the kind of relationships I actually wanted instead of settling for the ones that were offered. When I was finished writing, I tore up all the letters except the last one. That one I folded carefully and put in my purse, a reminder of who I was choosing to become. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in the one professional outfit I had managed to put together from thrift store finds, applied makeup to cover the remaining bruises on my face, and took a taxi to the courthouse where my family was gathering to divide up my life. The building was exactly as imposing as I remembered from the few times I had been there on business matters. High ceilings, marble floors, and an atmosphere of serious official business that made everyone speak in hushed tones. I found the directory and located the probate court, then spent a few minutes in the bathroom checking my appearance and trying to calm my racing heart. When I walked down the hallway toward the courtroom, I could hear voices through the partially open door. Rebecca's laugh, bright and cheerful, discussing vacation plans with someone who sounded like her lawyer. Marcus talking about renovations he wanted to make to my house, how he thought the kitchen was outdated and the master bedroom needed to be expanded. They sounded like people planning a celebration, not mourning a loss. They sounded like people who had just won the lottery, not people who had just lost their only remaining family member. I stood outside that door for a long moment, listening to them discuss my life like it was a business transaction, and I felt the last piece of my old self fall away. The woman who had walked into that Colorado conference 3 months ago, the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion to maintain relationships with people who saw her as a resource rather than a person, was gone. In her place stood someone I was still getting to know. Someone who had learned that being legally dead was preferable to being emotionally invisible. Someone who had discovered that the worst thing that could happen to her had already happened, which meant she had nothing left to lose. I pushed open the door and stepped into the courtroom, where my family was about to learn that some people are much harder to bury than they appear. The courtroom fell silent the moment I crossed the threshold. It was the kind of absolute quiet that happens when something so unexpected occurs that everyone's brain needs a moment to process what they're seeing. Rebecca was mid-sentence, gesturing animatedly to her lawyer about something involving vacation home investments, when she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish gasping for air. Marcus, who had been leaning back in his chair with his feet propped up on the conference table, nearly toppled backward as he scrambled to sit upright. "Hello, Rebecca," Marcus. I kept my voice calm and pleasant, as if I were greeting them at a casual family dinner, rather than interrupting my own estate division. "I hope I'm not late." The lawyer sitting next to Rebecca, a thin man in an expensive suit who I assumed was handling the probate, looked back and forth between us with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, but this is a closed proceeding. Are you perhaps looking for a different courtroom?" "No," I said, walking further into the room and taking a seat in the gallery behind where my siblings sat frozen. "This is exactly where I need to be. I'm Marilyn Edwards." The silence stretched even longer this time. Marcus found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I settled back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. "I'm curious about that. What exactly makes it impossible?" Rebecca finally managed to speak, though her voice was shaky and pitched higher than normal. "You're dead? We have a death certificate. We had a memorial service. There were flowers and everything." "I saw the memorial service," I said conversationally. "Lovely speech you gave, Rebecca. Very moving. Though I have to say, I was a bit surprised by some of the stories you told. Particularly the ones about our close relationship and my generous spirit." The probate judge, an older woman with steel gray hair who had been quietly reviewing documents at the head of the table, looked up with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Would someone like to explain to me what's happening here?" Rebecca's lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, I believe there may be some confusion. This woman claims to be the decedent, but as you can see from our documentation, Marilyn Edwards was declared deceased 3 months ago after an extended disappearance." "I can see that," the judge said dryly. She looked directly at me. "Ma'am, do you have identification?" I reached into my purse and pulled out the temporary documents James had helped me obtain, along with copies of my medical records from the Denver hospital. "I was in a car accident in Colorado, Your Honor. I was unconscious for 6 weeks and had no identification when I was found. The hospital called me Jane Doe until my memory returned." The judge accepted the papers and began reviewing them carefully. While she read, I could hear Rebecca whispering frantically to her lawyer, though I couldn't make out the words. Marcus sat in stunned silence, staring at me like I was a ghost that had materialized in his living room. "These documents appear to be genuine," the judge said finally. "Medical records from Denver General Hospital, discharge papers dated 4 days ago, and temporary identification issued by the state of Colorado." She looked back at me. "Do you have legal representation, Ms. Edwards?" "I do. James Morrison should be arriving shortly." As if summoned by my words, James appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath and carrying a briefcase that looked like it weighed more than he did. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor," he said, moving quickly to sit beside me. "Traffic was particularly challenging this morning." The judge nodded. "Mr. Morrison, I assume you're prepared to provide additional documentation establishing your client's identity?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have dental records, employment verification, and affidavits from several individuals who can attest to Ms. Edwards' identity." James began pulling folders from his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "We also have documentation regarding the circumstances of her disappearance and subsequent medical treatment." While James and the judge discussed legal procedures, I kept my attention focused on Rebecca and Marcus. The initial shock was wearing off, and I could see them beginning to process the implications of my unexpected resurrection. Rebecca kept glancing at her lawyer and whispering urgently. Marcus looked like he was calculating something in his head, probably trying to figure out how much money he had already spent based on his anticipated inheritance. "Your Honor," Rebecca's lawyer interjected, "while we certainly don't dispute this woman's right to exist, we do have concerns about the timing and circumstances of her reappearance. Our client filed the missing person report and subsequent death petition in good faith, following established legal procedures." "That's interesting," I said, speaking directly to the lawyer but keeping my eyes on Rebecca. "Could you tell me what steps your client took to locate me before filing that missing person report?" The lawyer shuffled through his papers. "Ms. Edwards was reported missing after failing to return from a business trip and not responding to multiple attempts at contact." "How many attempts?" I asked. "And what kind of contact?" Rebecca finally spoke up, her voice defensive. "I called your office. They said you were traveling. How many times did you call my office?" I don't remember exactly." "I do," I said pleasantly. "You called once. You spoke to Sarah, my receptionist, who told you I was at a conference in Colorado and would be back the following week. You didn't call back. You didn't ask for the name of the conference or the hotel where I was staying. You didn't call the Colorado police to report a missing person there. You didn't contact any hospitals. You waited exactly 6 weeks, then filed paperwork declaring me missing." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We were worried about you." "Were you?" I turned to look at him directly. "Worried enough to call my emergency contact at the office? Worried enough to check with my neighbors? Worried enough to file a police report in the city where I actually disappeared?" The judge was watching this exchange with obvious interest. "Ms. Edwards, are you suggesting that your family didn't make adequate efforts to locate you?" "I'm not suggesting it, Your Honor. I'm stating it as fact. They made no effort to locate me because they weren't interested in finding me alive. They were interested in having me declared dead as quickly as possible so they could inherit my assets." Rebecca's face flushed red. "That's not true. We loved you. We mourned you." "Did you?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, which I had been using to record our conversation since the moment I walked into the room. Because 3 days ago, I visited my former office. Marcus was there, in my office, using my desk, attempting to run my company despite having no qualifications or experience in management consulting. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I continued before he could speak. He spent 45 minutes trying to sell consulting services to a potential client without demonstrating any understanding of what those services actually involved. He's been representing himself as the interim managing director of a company he has never worked for, using credentials and expertise that belong to me. "I was trying to keep the business running," Marcus said weakly. "For you, to preserve your legacy." "My legacy?" I laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the formal courtroom. "Marcus, you've never shown the slightest interest in my work. You've called it boring corporate nonsense for 15 years. The only time you've ever asked me about my business was when you needed money for your latest get-rich-quick scheme." James placed a gentle hand on my arm, a reminder to stay calm and focused. I took a deep breath and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that will demonstrate my siblings' true motivations for having me declared dead." "Proceed," the judge said. James opened another folder and pulled out a stack of financial documents. These are records showing expenditures made by both Rebecca and Marcus Edwards in the past 6 weeks, apparently in anticipation of inheriting Ms. Edwards' estate. He handed copies to the judge and to Rebecca's lawyer. As you can see, Ms. Rebecca Edwards purchased a new BMW 3 weeks ago, putting down a deposit that represented her entire savings and financing the remainder based on anticipated inheritance income. She also put deposits down on a vacation condo in Maui and enrolled in an expensive MBA program at the University of Washington. The judge reviewed the documents with raised eyebrows. These purchases were made before the estate was settled? Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Rebecca Edwards appears to have been quite confident that the inheritance would come through as expected. James pulled out another set of papers. Mr. Marcus Edwards' expenditures are even more extensive. He purchased a Tesla, a boat, and put a down payment on a house in Bellevue. He also invested heavily in several high-risk cryptocurrency ventures and started a consulting firm using his sister's business model and client contacts. That's not illegal, Marcus protested. I was planning for the future. A future that required me to remain dead, I observed. Tell me, Marcus, what was your plan if I had somehow survived the accident and returned to reclaim my business? He didn't answer, but the expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. He had never considered that possibility because he had never wanted to consider it. The judge was quiet for several minutes, reading through all the documentation James had provided. Finally, she looked up at Rebecca and Marcus. I have to say, this is quite unusual. In most cases where someone is presumed dead, the family members are hoping to be wrong. They file the legal paperwork reluctantly, after exhausting all other options. They certainly don't begin spending money they haven't inherited yet. Rebecca's lawyer tried to salvage the situation. Your Honor, my clients were operating under the reasonable assumption that Ms. Edwards had died in an accident. They were attempting to move forward with their lives after a tragic loss. By immediately claiming her business and assets, I said. By giving interviews to the local news about what a wonderful sister I was, despite the fact that we hadn't had a meaningful conversation in 5 years. By hosting a memorial service where they accepted condolences and donations from people who actually cared about me. You accepted donations? The judge asked sharply. Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. People offered to help with expenses. What expenses? I asked. You didn't pay for a search and rescue operation. You didn't hire a private investigator. You didn't even pay for the memorial service, since it was held at the community center where Mom used to volunteer, and the food was all donated by neighbors. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Rebecca's lawyer frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage his client's position. Marcus was staring at his hands, his face flushed with what I hoped was shame but was probably just embarrassment at being caught. Your Honor, James said, we'd like to request an immediate injunction preventing any further distribution of Ms. Edwards' assets, as well as an investigation into any funds that may have already been inappropriately accessed. The judge nodded. Granted. Mr. Morrison, please prepare the necessary paperwork. Ms. Edwards, while I'm certainly glad to see that you're very much alive, this situation raises some serious questions about the conduct of your family members. She turned to Rebecca and Marcus, her expression stern. I'm particularly troubled by the evidence suggesting that you began liquidating assets and making major purchases before the estate was actually settled. That level of confidence in a particular outcome suggests either remarkable optimism or deliberate deception. Rebecca finally found her voice again, though it came out as a desperate plea. Your Honor, we thought she was dead. We were grieving. We weren't thinking clearly. Grieving people don't typically go car shopping, the judge replied dryly. They certainly don't start new businesses using their deceased relatives' contacts and reputation. Marcus tried a different approach. Marilyn, you have to understand, we were trying to honor your memory. We thought you would want us to continue your work. I looked at him for a long moment, this half-brother who had never held a steady job for more than 6 months, who had spent his entire adult life avoiding responsibility and expecting other people to support his lifestyle. Marcus, in 15 years of running my business, how many times did you ask me about my work? How many times did you show any interest in what I did or how I did it? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The answer is 0, I continued. You've never asked me about my clients, my methods, my challenges, or my successes. The only time you've ever shown any interest in my business was when you needed money and thought I might give you a job you weren't qualified for. I turned to Rebecca. And you, dear sister, have spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a workaholic with no life outside my office. You've criticized my priorities, my choices, and my values. You've accused me of being selfish and controlling. But suddenly, when I'm dead, I become this generous, loving sister who sacrificed everything for your happiness? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine or performative. We did love you, Marilyn. We do love you. We're not good at showing it. You're right, I said. You're not good at showing love, but you're excellent at showing greed. The judge cleared her throat. Ms. Edwards, while I understand your anger, we do need to focus on the legal issues at hand. Mr. Morrison, what are you requesting in terms of remedies? James stood and straightened his jacket. Your Honor, we're requesting full restoration of Ms. Edwards' legal status, immediate return of all assets and properties, and an accounting of any funds that may have been improperly accessed or spent. We're also requesting that the court consider whether criminal charges are appropriate for the fraudulent use of business credentials and client relationships. Criminal charges? Marcus looked like he might be sick. You've been operating a business under false pretenses, I explained. You've used my reputation and client relationships to generate income for yourself. You've represented yourself as having qualifications and experience that you don't possess. In most states, that's considered fraud. Rebecca's lawyer whispered something urgently in her ear, and she shook her head vigorously. Then she looked directly at me, her expression shifting from shock to anger. Fine. You want to know the truth? You're right. We weren't looking for you because we didn't want to find you. The courtroom went quiet again, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like the moment when someone finally stops pretending and says what they really mean. We were tired of being your charity cases, Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. Tired of having to grovel for every dollar. Tired of listening to your lectures about responsibility and financial planning. Tired of feeling like failures because we couldn't live up to your impossible standards. Marcus nodded, apparently encouraged by his sister's honesty. You never let us forget that you were the successful one, the one who had everything figured out. Every conversation was a reminder of how much we owed you, how much we needed you. So when you disappeared, Rebecca said, it felt like freedom. For the first time in our adult lives, we didn't have to ask permission or justify our choices to Big Sister Marilyn. We could just live. I listened to this confession with a strange sense of relief. Finally, after years of polite family dinners and strained holiday conversations, we were having an honest discussion about our relationship. You're absolutely right, I said, which seemed to surprise them both. I did lecture you. I did make you feel like failures. I did use money as a way to maintain control over our relationship. They exchanged glances, clearly not expecting me to agree with them. But you know what I never did? I continued. I never tried to have you declared dead so I could steal your assets. I never lied to a court about our relationship. I never gave speeches about how much I loved you while secretly celebrating your disappearance. The anger was building in my chest now, but it felt clean and righteous rather than bitter. You want to be angry with me for being controlling? Fine. You want to resent me for having higher expectations than you were willing to meet? That's your right. But don't you dare try to justify theft and fraud by claiming I was a difficult sister. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. We weren't trying to steal anything. We thought you were dead. You thought I was dead because you wanted me to be dead. I said bluntly, you didn't look for me because finding me alive would have been inconvenient for your plans. Rebecca was crying now, and these tears looked real. That's not true. We never wanted you to die. Maybe not, I acknowledged. But you certainly weren't heartbroken about it, and the moment you thought I was gone, you couldn't wait to divide up everything I had worked for. The judge had been listening to this family drama with obvious fascination, but now she intervened. While this conversation is certainly illuminating, we do need to resolve the legal issues. Ms. Edwards, What is your intention regarding your estate and your relationship with your siblings? It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since the moment I decided to appear at this hearing. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Reconciliation? All of the above? Your Honor, I said slowly, I want my assets restored and my legal status corrected. I want an accounting of any money that has been spent or committed in my name. And I want my siblings to understand that actions have consequences. I looked directly at Rebecca and Marcus. You've both made financial commitments based on money that didn't belong to you. You've signed contracts and made purchases assuming you would inherit wealth you hadn't earned. Those are your problems to solve, not mine. Rebecca's face went pale. Marilyn, the car payments, the condo deposit, the MBA program. I can't afford any of that without the inheritance. Then you shouldn't have committed to them before the inheritance was finalized, I replied. That's what responsible adults call basic financial planning. Marcus looked equally panicked. I'll lose everything. The house, the boat, the business investments. Yes, I said simply. You will. The judge was taking notes throughout this exchange. Ms. Edwards, are you open to any kind of settlement or family arrangement? I considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, I would have bailed them out. I would have paid their debts and smoothed over their mistakes, and convinced myself that this was what family members did for each other. I would have enabled their irresponsibility one more time and hoped that somehow it would finally teach them to be better people. But 3 months ago, I hadn't known what it felt like to be erased from existence by the people who were supposed to love me most. No, Your Honor, I said finally. I think it's time my siblings learned to solve their own problems. The rest of the hearing was largely procedural. James presented additional documentation establishing my identity and my legal right to reclaim my assets. The judge issued orders restoring my legal status, freezing any accounts or properties that had been transferred based on my presumed death, and requiring a full accounting of all expenditures made by Rebecca and Marcus. She also referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential fraud charges, particularly regarding Marcus's use of my business credentials and client relationships. When the gavel finally came down, Rebecca and Marcus looked like they had been hit by a truck. Their lawyer was already discussing damage control strategies and bankruptcy options. James was organizing his paperwork with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won a challenging case, and I felt nothing at all. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not relief. Just an empty space where my family relationships used to be, and the strange freedom that comes from finally accepting that some bridges are meant to be burned. As we gathered our things to leave, Rebecca approached me one last time. Marilyn, she said quietly, is there any chance we can work this out? Any way to fix this? I looked at her for a long moment, this sister I had loved imperfectly but consistently for 35 years. Rebecca, I said gently, you declared me dead and threw a party to celebrate inheriting my money. What exactly do you think there is to fix? She didn't have an answer for that. Outside the courthouse, James and I stood in the drizzling Seattle rain and discussed next steps. There would be more paperwork, more hearings, more legal procedures to fully restore my life to its previous state. It would take months to untangle everything Rebecca and Marcus had done in my absence. Are you sure about not offering them any kind of settlement? James asked. It might be easier to buy them out of their debts than to let this drag through the courts. I thought about his suggestion as I watched my siblings exit the courthouse and walk to their respective cars, both probably wondering how they were going to explain to their creditors that their anticipated inheritances had just evaporated. No, I said finally. Easy isn't the same as right, and I've spent too many years making things easy for people who never bothered to make things easy for me. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, I realized that being declared dead had been the best thing that ever happened to me. It had shown me exactly what my life was worth to the people I thought mattered most. More importantly, it had shown me what my life was worth to me. I had spent 15 years building a successful business, accumulating wealth, and maintaining family relationships that existed primarily on paper. I had thought I was living a full life, but really I had just been going through the motions of what I thought a successful life should look like. Now I had a chance to build something different. Something real. Something that belonged entirely to me. The rain was coming down harder now, but I didn't mind. I had been through worse storms than this, and I had survived them all. The weeks following the courtroom confrontation passed in a blur of legal documentation, asset recovery, and the surreal experience of reclaiming a life that had been divided up and distributed in my absence. James worked tirelessly to untangle the financial mess Rebecca and Marcus had created, while I found myself in the strange position of having to prove my identity to banks, insurance companies, and government agencies that had already processed my death certificate. The first major hurdle came when I tried to regain access to my business accounts. The bank manager, a nervous man named Peterson who kept apologizing while simultaneously questioning my legitimacy, required 3 forms of identification, 2 character witnesses, and a notarized statement from the hospital in Denver before he would even discuss unlocking my accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me that it was harder to prove I was alive than it had been for my siblings to prove I was dead. My office building presented its own challenges. Marcus had signed a lease transfer agreement claiming authority as my heir, and the property management company was reluctant to reverse the arrangement without extensive legal documentation. I spent an entire afternoon in a sterile conference room, providing fingerprints and answering security questions about my own business practices, while Marcus's belongings were boxed up and removed from what had been my office for over a decade. The most surreal moment came when I had to fire myself from unemployment benefits. Apparently, Rebecca had filed a claim on my behalf as part of the estate settlement process, listing me as permanently unable to work due to death. The unemployment office representative, a weary woman who had clearly seen every possible bureaucratic nightmare, listened to my explanation with the kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with administrative absurdities. "So you're calling to report that you're no longer unemployed because you're no longer dead?" she asked, typing notes into her computer. "That's correct," I confirmed. "And you have documentation proving you're alive?" "I do." "Well," she said with a slight smile, "that's a new one. I'll need you to come in and sign some forms." Each day brought new evidence of how thoroughly Rebecca and Marcus had planned to erase me from existence. I discovered that Rebecca had contacted my insurance company to begin the process of claiming my life insurance policy. Marcus had reached out to my investment advisor about transferring my portfolio to his name. They had even contacted my dentist to request my dental records, presumably to make the death identification process smoother. The level of preparation was staggering. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made in grief. It had been a calculated plan executed with remarkable efficiency. They had turned my disappearance into a business opportunity, complete with timelines, documentation, and profit projections. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when I accessed my email accounts and found hundreds of messages from clients, colleagues, and business associates expressing their condolences and sharing memories of our working relationships. These people had genuinely mourned my death, had taken time from their busy lives to honor my memory, and had been completely deceived by Rebecca and Marcus's performance of grief. I spent hours reading through these messages, many of which brought tears to my eyes. Clients wrote about how I had helped them navigate difficult transitions in their companies. Colleagues shared stories about my mentorship and guidance. Former employees described how I had supported their career development and encouraged their professional growth. It was strange to read my own eulogy while sitting alive in my hotel room, but it was also illuminating. These professional relationships, which I had always considered secondary to family bonds, had apparently meant more to both parties than I had realized. People who saw me once a month in business meetings had taken more time to honor my memory than my own siblings had taken to search for my living body. The contrast was particularly stark when I found the email thread between Rebecca and my assistant, Sarah, from the week after I had gone missing. Sarah had been genuinely worried about my extended absence and had contacted Rebecca to see if the family had any information about my whereabouts. Rebecca's responses were masterful examples of misdirection and false concern. "We're worried sick," Rebecca had written. "This is so unlike Marilyn. She would never just disappear without telling anyone." The message was followed by detailed questions about my travel itinerary, my client meetings, and my personal habits, all phrased as concerned inquiries, but clearly designed to gather information that would support her missing person claim. Sarah had offered to contact the Denver police, to call the conference organizers, to hire a private investigator. Rebecca had declined each offer, claiming that the family was handling all investigative efforts privately. She had thanked Sarah for her concern and asked her to keep the office running smoothly during this difficult time. Reading this exchange, I realized that Sarah had been more genuinely concerned about my welfare than my own sister. She had been ready to spend her own time and money searching for me, while Rebecca had been actively preventing anyone from looking too hard. The investigation into Marcus's fraudulent business activities revealed an even more elaborate deception. He had not only been operating out of my office and using my credentials, he had been actively soliciting my former clients, claiming that he was my designated successor and that I had personally trained him to continue my work. He had presented himself as my protégé, someone who had been working closely with me for years and understood my methods intimately. Several clients had been suspicious of his claims, particularly when his consultation methods bore no resemblance to my approach, but Marcus had explained these discrepancies by saying that he was implementing new strategies I had been developing before my death. He had convinced at least 3 major clients to sign new contracts with him, generating substantial revenue that had funded his spending spree. The district attorney's office was taking these fraud charges seriously, particularly given the sophisticated nature of the deception and the substantial amounts of money involved. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Chen who specialized in white-collar crime, explained that Marcus could face significant jail time if convicted on all charges. "This isn't just identity theft," she explained during our meeting. "He's committed mail fraud, wire fraud, and possibly racketeering if we can prove this was part of a larger conspiracy with your sister. The fact that he did all of this while you were declared legally dead adds another layer of complexity." I found myself in the uncomfortable position of being asked whether I wanted to pursue maximum penalties against my own brother. Linda Chen was building a strong case, but she needed my cooperation to move forward with the most serious charges. Part of me wanted to see Marcus face the full consequences of his actions, but another part of me still remembered the boy who used to call me when he had nightmares. "What would you recommend?" I asked, honestly. "Press charges on everything. This level of fraud doesn't happen by accident, and the fact that he continued the deception, even after clients started questioning his credentials, shows a willingness to deceive that goes beyond desperation into criminal intent." I told her I needed time to think about it. The media attention was something I hadn't anticipated. Apparently, the story of a woman appearing alive at her own estate division was too irresistible for local news outlets to ignore. A reporter named Janet Walsh from the Seattle Times had gotten wind of the court proceedings and wanted to do a feature story about my resurrection. I initially declined all interview requests, but Janet was persistent. She called my hotel room, showed up at my office building, and even approached James asking for a statement. Finally, she sent me a handwritten letter explaining that she was interested in the story, not for its sensational value, but because it highlighted important issues about elder abuse, family financial exploitation, and the vulnerabilities in our legal system for protecting people who disappear without immediate advocates. Her letter was thoughtful and well-researched. She had clearly done her homework about similar cases and understood the broader implications of what had happened to me. Against James's advice, I agreed to meet with her for coffee to discuss the possibility of an interview. Janet turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. She didn't push for sensational details or try to paint my story as a simple tale of family betrayal. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about the systemic issues that had allowed my siblings to move so quickly through the legal process without adequate safeguards. "How many other people are in similar situations?" she asked. "How many missing persons cases are really just families jumping to conclusions because it's financially convenient?" It was a disturbing question, and one that I had been thinking about myself. During my research at the library, I had found several cases of people being declared dead prematurely, often by family members who stood to benefit financially from their demise. Most of these cases involved elderly individuals or people with valuable assets and complicated family relationships. "I was lucky," I told Janet. "I was unconscious in a hospital where I received excellent care, and I had the resources to hire good legal representation when I woke up. But what happens to people who don't have those advantages? What happens to someone who disappears and doesn't have family members willing to search for them? The interview, when it was published the following week, was more balanced and thoughtful than I had expected. Janet focused on the legal and social issues rather than the personal drama, though she did include enough details about Rebecca and Marcus's actions to make their behavior clearly inexcusable. The story generated significant public interest and sparked discussions about reforming the legal processes for declaring people deceased. More importantly for me, the article brought contact from several people who had experienced similar situations. A woman named Dorothy Martinez reached out to tell me about her elderly father, who had been declared dead by his stepchildren while he was recovering from a stroke in a care facility in another state. A man named Robert Kim shared his story about being presumed dead after a hiking accident, only to discover that his ex-wife had already begun liquidating their joint assets. These conversations helped me understand that my experience, while deeply personal and painful, was part of a larger pattern of family members exploiting vulnerable situations for financial gain. It also helped me realize that my decision about how to handle Rebecca and Marcus's legal consequences would send a message about whether such behavior would be tolerated or punished. The financial recovery process was more complex than I had anticipated. While the court had ordered the return of all assets, much of the money Rebecca and Marcus had spent was gone forever. Rebecca's BMW had depreciated significantly the moment she drove it off the lot. Marcus's cryptocurrency investments had lost most of their value in a market downturn. The vacation condo deposit was non-refundable. Between them, they had managed to spend or lose nearly $200,000 in the space of 3 months. Rebecca was facing bankruptcy, and Marcus was desperately trying to liquidate his remaining assets to cover his obligations. Their financial recklessness had consequences that extended far beyond their relationship with me. The house that Marcus had put a down payment on was now in foreclosure proceedings. The Tesla he had purchased was being repossessed. The boat he had bought was sitting in a marina, accumulating storage fees he couldn't pay. Rebecca's MBA program had refused to refund her tuition, even when presented with documentation showing that her enrollment had been fraudulently funded. Watching their financial collapse should have given me satisfaction, but instead it just made me tired. These were 2 middle-aged adults who had made catastrophically poor decisions based on greed and entitlement, and now they were facing the consequences of those choices. There was no lesson to be learned here, no moment of redemption or growth, just the predictable outcome of people who had never learned to think beyond their immediate desires. James advised me that I could pursue civil litigation to recover the money they had spent, but the practical reality was that neither of them had any assets left to seize. Their creditors were already circling, and I would be competing with banks, credit card companies, and other secured lenders for any remaining value. The legal fees would likely exceed any potential recovery. Sometimes, James said, the best revenge is just walking away and letting people live with the consequences of their own choices. It was good advice, and I decided to follow it. The emotional recovery was more challenging than the financial or legal aspects. I found myself dealing with a grief that was different from anything I had experienced before. I wasn't mourning the death of my siblings, exactly, but I was mourning the death of my illusions about our relationship. I was mourning the family I had thought I belonged to, the bonds I had believed existed despite all evidence to the contrary. For weeks I found myself angry at unexpected moments. I would be walking down the street or eating lunch in a restaurant, and suddenly I would be overwhelmed by rage at Rebecca's performance of grief, or Marcus's casual theft of my professional reputation. The anger felt fresh and raw each time, as if I were discovering their betrayal all over again. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Brennan, who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of complicated grief, mourning not just the loss of family relationships, but the loss of my own naivety about those relationships. You're not just processing what they did to you, she explained. You're processing the realization that they were capable of doing it at all. That requires grieving your previous understanding of who they were and who you were in relation to them. Dr. Brennan also helped me recognize patterns in my family relationships that I had been unconsciously perpetuating for decades. My tendency to use financial support as a way of maintaining connection had enabled Rebecca and Marcus's sense of entitlement. My reluctance to set boundaries or demand reciprocity had taught them that they could take without giving. My fear of conflict had allowed small resentments to grow into deep hostility without ever being addressed. None of that excuses what they did, she was careful to clarify. But understanding your role in the dynamic can help you make different choices going forward. One of the most difficult realizations was that I had been using my family relationships as a way of avoiding the deeper work of building authentic connections with other people. It was easier to maintain superficial relationships with Rebecca and Marcus, even when those relationships were dysfunctional, than to risk the vulnerability of forming new bonds with people who might actually care about me. My professional relationships, while more satisfying than my family connections, had also been kept at arm's length. I had colleagues and clients I respected, but I had few genuine friendships. I had spent so much energy managing my siblings' financial and emotional needs that I had little left over for cultivating the kind of relationships that might have provided real support during a crisis. The realization that I had been fundamentally alone even before my accident was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that my carefully constructed life had been built on foundations that were essentially hollow. Liberating because it meant I could start over with a clearer understanding of what I actually wanted from my relationships. I began reaching out to some of the colleagues who had sent condolence messages, not to discuss business but to explore the possibility of friendship. I was surprised by how many of them responded warmly to my invitations for lunch or coffee. Several mentioned that they had always wanted to get to know me better, but had assumed I was too busy or too private for social relationships. One of these reconnections proved particularly meaningful. Elena Rodriguez had been a client for several years, but our relationship had always been strictly professional, despite my genuine respect for her leadership style and business acumen. When I called to thank her for the beautiful condolence letter she had sent, she insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate my return to the land of the living. Over wine and conversation that stretched well past midnight, Elena shared her own story of family betrayal and financial manipulation. Her ex-husband had attempted to gain control of her business during their divorce proceedings, using their children as leverage to pressure her into surrendering assets she had built independently. The legal battle had lasted 3 years and cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, but she had ultimately prevailed. The hardest part wasn't the money, she told me. It was accepting that someone I had loved and trusted was capable of using my own children against me. It changed my understanding of what love actually means. Elena's story helped me realize that my experience, while uniquely painful, was not uniquely isolating. Many people had survived betrayals by people they loved and had found ways to rebuild their lives around more authentic relationships. Her friendship became one of the unexpected gifts of my resurrection, a reminder that genuine connection was possible even after trust had been shattered. As the legal proceedings wound down and my life slowly returned to something resembling normal, I found myself facing the question of what I wanted that normal to look like. I could return to my old routines, rebuild my business relationships, and pretend that nothing fundamental had changed. Or I could use this disruption as an opportunity to create something entirely new. The decision was made easier by the fact that my business had suffered significant damage during Marcus's management. Several major clients had terminated their contracts after discovering the deception, and others were requiring extensive relationship repair before they would consider working with the company again. The financial losses were substantial, but more importantly, the reputation I had spent 15 years building had been compromised. I could fight to rebuild what I had lost, or I could accept this as a sign that it was time for a change. I chose change. With James's help, I began the process of selling Edwards Strategic Solutions to a larger consulting firm that was interested in acquiring our client relationships and intellectual property. The sale price was less than the company would have been worth before Marcus's interference, but it was enough to provide financial security while I figured out what came next. The buyer, McKinsey Consulting Group, offered to hire me as a senior advisor, which would have allowed me to continue doing similar work under their umbrella. I thanked them for the offer but declined. For the first time in my adult life, I wanted to step away from the career that had defined me and explore other possibilities. I used some of the proceeds from the sale to establish a legal defense fund for people who had been wrongly declared dead or had their estates fraudulently claimed by family members. Working with Linda Chen and several other attorneys, we created a nonprofit organization that could provide legal assistance to people facing similar situations. The fund was modest, but it was enough to help a few people each year navigate the complex legal process of reclaiming their lives. The rest of the money went into investments that would provide steady income without requiring active management. I wasn't interested in accumulating wealth for its own sake anymore. I just wanted enough financial security to give me the freedom to choose how to spend my time. With my immediate practical concerns resolved, I faced the more existential question of how to use that time. For months, I had been so focused on recovering from Rebecca and Marcus's betrayal that I hadn't given much thought to what I actually wanted from life, beyond basic justice and financial stability. The answer came to me gradually, through small experiences that reminded me of interests and passions I had set aside during my years of building a business empire. I started reading fiction again, something I hadn't done since college. I took a pottery class at the community center, partly because I had always been curious about working with clay, and partly because I wanted to try something completely unrelated to my professional skills. I began volunteering at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. The work was challenging in entirely different ways, from business consulting, requiring patience and empathy rather than strategic thinking and problem solving. But it was also deeply rewarding in ways that closing business deals had never been. Most surprisingly, I started writing. It began as a form of therapy, journaling about my experiences with family betrayal and legal resurrection. But gradually, the writing became something more creative and exploratory. I found myself working on short stories, essays, and even the beginning of a novel about a woman who discovers she has been living someone else's life. The writing gave me a way to process not just what had happened to me, but what it meant and how it connected to larger themes about family, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love. It also gave me a sense of purpose that was entirely independent of external validation or financial reward. 6 months after the courthouse confrontation, I was sitting in my new apartment, a smaller but more comfortable space that felt like home in a way my old house never had, when my phone rang. The number was familiar, but I almost didn't answer it. It was Rebecca. Marilyn? Her voice was tentative, uncertain. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I was hoping we could talk. I considered hanging up, but curiosity got the better of me. What do you want to talk about, Rebecca? I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not just for legal reasons or because I got caught, but because I finally understand what we did to you. I was quiet for a moment, trying to gauge whether this was genuine remorse or another manipulation. What do you understand? That we never saw you as a person. We saw you as a resource, a solution to our problems, a safety net we could rely on without having to give anything back. And when you disappeared, our first thought wasn't about losing our sister. It was about losing our source of support. The admission was more honest than anything Rebecca had said to me in years, but I wasn't sure how to respond to it. Why are you telling me this now? Because losing everything made me realize how much I had taken for granted. Not just the money, though that's been devastating, but the security of knowing you were there. I never appreciated that until it was gone. I listened as Rebecca described the past few months of her life. The bankruptcy proceedings, the repossession of her car, the humiliation of moving back in with a college friend because she couldn't afford rent, the MBA program she had lost, the job interviews where she had to explain the gap in her employment history. I'm not asking for money, she said quickly, perhaps hearing skepticism in my silence. I know I have no right to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand what we did was unforgivable, and I'm sorry. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt incomplete. Understanding the wrongness of her actions was different from taking full responsibility for them. And even genuine remorse couldn't undo the fundamental revelation about her character that her actions had provided. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But I need you to understand that what you and Marcus did wasn't just about money or even just about the legal issues. You erased me from existence because it was convenient for you. That's not something I can just forgive because you're sorry." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said softly. "I know we can't go back to the way things were. I guess I was hoping maybe we could find some way forward." "What would that look like to you?" "I don't know. Maybe we could start small. Maybe we could try to actually get to know each other as people, instead of just as family members who are stuck with each other." It was a more thoughtful response than I had expected, and it touched on something Dr. Brennan and I had discussed. The family relationships I had mourned had never actually existed. They had been based on obligation and financial dependency, rather than genuine affection or shared values. But that didn't necessarily mean that different relationships couldn't be built in their place. "I need time to think about that," I told Rebecca. "A lot of time." "I understand. I just wanted you to know that the option is there if you ever want to explore it." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of second chances. I thought about the difference between forgiving someone because it serves your own healing and forgiving them because they deserve it. I thought about whether relationships could be rebuilt on entirely new foundations after the old ones had been completely destroyed. I didn't have answers to any of these questions, but I was grateful to have the luxury of time to consider them. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't responsible for managing anyone else's emotions or solving anyone else's problems. I could make decisions based purely on what felt right for my own well-being and growth. Marcus never called to apologize. According to the updates I received from Linda Chen, he was fighting the criminal charges and maintaining his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence of his fraud. His lawyer was arguing that his actions had been motivated by grief and confusion rather than criminal intent, and that he had genuinely believed he was preserving my legacy by continuing my work. The strategy wasn't working. The prosecution's case was strong, and Marcus's refusal to accept responsibility was not helping his cause. Linda predicted that he would ultimately accept a plea deal that would involve restitution payments and community service, possibly with some jail time, depending on how much cooperation he was willing to provide. I found that I cared less about Marcus's legal fate than I had expected. The criminal justice system would handle his case according to its own procedures and priorities. My role was simply to provide testimony when required, and otherwise to focus on my own recovery and growth. That recovery continued to surprise me with its complexity and depth. I had expected to feel angry and betrayed, and I did. But I also felt relief, liberation, and a strange kind of gratitude for the clarity that Rebecca and Marcus's actions had provided. They had forced me to confront truths about my relationships and my life that I might have continued to avoid indefinitely. A year after my resurrection, I hosted a small dinner party in my apartment for the friends I had made during my recovery. Elena was there, along with Dr. Brennan, Janet Walsh, the reporter who had become a genuine friend, and several people from my volunteer work and writing group. As I looked around the table at these people who knew my story and cared about my well-being without any expectation of financial benefit, I realized that I had built something I had never had before, a chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than blood ties and obligations. The conversation that evening ranged from politics to literature, to shared memories of the various adventures we had shared over the past year. No one mentioned my siblings or the legal proceedings or the dramatic circumstances that had brought us together. We simply enjoyed each other's company and the satisfaction of connections that had grown organically out of shared interests and values. Later, as I was cleaning up the dinner dishes, Elena lingered to help and to share some news she had been saving for the end of the evening. "I've been thinking about our conversation last month," she said, "about the difficulties of starting over after betrayal. I have a proposition for you." Elena had been considering expanding her business to include consulting services, and she wanted to offer me a partnership in this new venture. It would be smaller than my previous company, more focused on specific types of clients, but it would also be built from the ground up with values and practices that reflected who I had become, rather than who I had been. "I'm not interested in recreating your old business," she clarified. "I'm interested in creating something new with someone whose judgment and integrity I trust completely." The offer was tempting, not because I needed the income or the professional validation, but because it represented an opportunity to apply my skills in service of something meaningful. Elena's existing business focused on sustainable practices and social responsibility, values that aligned with my own evolving priorities. I told her I would consider it, and I spent the following weeks thinking about what kind of work would feel worthwhile at this stage of my life. I realized that I wasn't interested in helping large corporations maximize profits or streamline operations. But I was very interested in helping smaller organizations that were trying to make positive changes in their communities or their industries. 3 months later, I signed the partnership agreement for Marilyn Edwards Consulting, a firm that specialized in helping nonprofit organizations and social enterprises develop sustainable business models. Our client base included environmental groups, community development organizations, and businesses that prioritized social impact alongside financial success. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that my previous career had never been. Instead of helping companies become more efficient at doing things I wasn't sure were worth doing, I was helping organizations become more effective at doing things I believed in. Instead of working with executives who saw employees and communities as resources to be optimized, I was working with leaders who were trying to create positive change in the world. The financial returns were modest compared to what I had earned in my previous career, but the personal satisfaction was exponentially greater. I went to work each day knowing that my efforts were contributing to something larger than profit maximization, and I came home each evening feeling like I had used my talents in service of values I could genuinely support. 2 years after my legal resurrection, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a conference about estate planning and elder protection. The organizers had read Janet's article about my case and thought my perspective would be valuable for attorneys, financial planners, and family members who were dealing with similar issues. I almost declined the invitation, but Elena encouraged me to accept it. "Your story could help prevent other people from going through what you experienced," she pointed out. "That seems worth a few hours of discomfort." The speaking engagement turned out to be one of the most meaningful experiences of my new life. The audience included not only professionals who worked in estate planning and elder law, but also family members who were struggling with their own complicated dynamics around money, inheritance, and care for aging relatives. During the question and answer session, a woman named Margaret raised her hand and described a situation eerily similar to my own. Her elderly mother had disappeared during a family vacation, and Margaret's siblings were already discussing the distribution of their mother's assets, despite the fact that no body had been found and the search was still ongoing. "How do I make them understand that we should be looking for her, not planning her funeral?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking with frustration and grief. I shared some practical advice about legal protections and advocacy resources, but more importantly, I shared the emotional truth that had taken me months to fully understand, that people who are eager to benefit from someone's death are revealing something fundamental about their character that cannot be explained away by grief or shock. "Trust your instincts," I told Margaret. "If something feels wrong about how your family is responding to this crisis, it probably is wrong. Don't let anyone convince you that you're being naive or overly optimistic for wanting to continue searching for your mother." After the conference, several attendees approached me with their own stories of family financial manipulation, premature estate settlements, and the challenge of protecting vulnerable relatives from predatory family members. I realized that my experience, while uniquely dramatic in its particular details, was part of a much larger pattern of elder abuse and family exploitation. This realization led to another unexpected opportunity. A legal advocacy organization asked me to serve on their board of directors, bringing my perspective as someone who had survived family financial abuse to their policy development and educational programs. The work involved reviewing proposed legislation, developing educational materials, and occasionally testifying before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. The advocacy work became another source of meaning and purpose in my rebuilt life. It allowed me to channel my anger about what had happened to me into efforts to prevent similar situations from happening to other people. It also connected me with a community of advocates, attorneys, and survivors who were working towards systemic changes rather than just individual recovery. 3 years after my resurrection, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering reforms to the legal process for declaring people deceased. The proposed legislation would require more extensive search efforts, longer waiting periods, and additional safeguards before someone could be declared legally dead in the absence of clear evidence. My testimony focused not on the dramatic details of my own case, but on the systematic vulnerabilities that had allowed my siblings to move so quickly through the legal process without adequate oversight. I emphasized that the current system placed too much trust in family members who might have financial incentives to expedite the death declaration process. The assumption that family members always have their missing relatives' best interests at heart is not supported by the evidence, I told the committee. In cases involving substantial assets, family members may have conflicting interests that need to be acknowledged and addressed through stronger legal safeguards. The legislation ultimately passed with bipartisan support, creating new requirements for search efforts and family financial disclosure in death declaration cases. While it wouldn't have prevented what happened to me, since I was unconscious in a hospital rather than missing in a way that could have been discovered through additional search efforts, it did address some of the systematic issues that allowed families to prioritize inheritance proceedings over genuine efforts to locate missing relatives. The advocacy work also provided an unexpected form of closure. Instead of remaining focused on my own victimization, I was able to contribute to efforts that might protect other people from similar experiences. The work transformed my personal trauma into a source of expertise and authority that could be used for positive social change. On the 4th anniversary of my accident, I drove to the airport and took a flight to Denver. It was my first time back in the city since my discharge from the hospital, and I wasn't entirely sure why I felt compelled to return. But something about marking this anniversary in the place where my resurrection had begun felt important. I visited the hospital where I had been treated, though I didn't recognize any of the staff, and most of them were too busy to talk with someone who was no longer a patient. I walked through the neighborhoods where I had recovered my memories and planned my return to life. I sat in the coffee shop where I had first read about my own memorial service and made the decision to reclaim my existence. The city looked different than I remembered, though I wasn't sure if that was because it had actually changed or because I was seeing it through different eyes. The mountains seemed more beautiful, the sky more expansive, the people more interesting and complex than they had during my previous visits for business conferences. On my last day in Denver, I drove out to the site where my accident had occurred. The intersection looked ordinary, unremarkable, just another place where city streets crossed and traffic lights directed the flow of cars and pedestrians. There was no memorial marker, no indication that this was a place where someone's life had been fundamentally altered. Standing at that intersection, I tried to remember what I had been thinking about during those final moments before the drunk driver ran the red light and sent my car spinning into the concrete barrier. I had probably been thinking about my flight schedule, my upcoming meetings, the routine concerns of a business trip that was nearly complete. I certainly hadn't been thinking about family relationships, or the meaning of my existence, or the question of what kind of life was worth living. Those considerations had come later, during the long months of recovery and legal battle and emotional reconstruction that followed. But I was thinking about them now, standing in the place where my old life had ended and my new one had begun. I was thinking about the strange gift that trauma sometimes provides, the opportunity to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, what actually matters, and what merely seems to matter because it's familiar or expected. The accident hadn't given me wisdom, exactly, but it had given me perspective. The betrayal by Rebecca and Marcus hadn't made me a better person, but it had forced me to become a more honest one. The legal battle hadn't provided justice in any cosmic sense, but it had provided clarity about the difference between relationships based on genuine care and relationships based on mutual convenience. As I stood at that intersection, I felt a surprising sense of gratitude. Not for the accident itself, which had been genuinely traumatic and could easily have killed me. Not for my siblings' betrayal, which had caused real damage that would never be completely healed. But for the opportunity to rebuild my life according to my own values, rather than other people's expectations. The woman who had driven to this intersection 4 years ago had been successful by, he doesn't have money or status or big plans to get rich quick. But he's kind, and he's honest, and he's teaching me that maybe those things matter more than I thought they did. The wedding invitation represented a test of the boundaries I had established and the new relationship dynamics I was trying to create. Attending would signal a willingness to maintain some connection with Rebecca, but it would also require spending time with extended family members, who had probably heard various versions of our story and formed their own opinions about who was right and who was wrong. After discussing the situation with Dr. Brennan and Elena, I decided to attend the wedding, but on my own terms. I would go alone, rather than bringing a guest who might feel uncomfortable with the family dynamics. I would stay for the ceremony and reception, but leave early if the situation became stressful. And I would treat it as an opportunity to observe how Rebecca was choosing to live her life now, rather than as a statement about our future relationship. The wedding was small and simple, held in a community center with decorations that Rebecca had clearly made herself. David turned out to be a quiet, thoughtful man who seemed genuinely devoted to Rebecca and uninterested in the family drama that had preceded his arrival in her life. During the brief conversation we had at the reception, he thanked me for coming and expressed hope that Rebecca and I could find some way to move forward together. "She's not the same person who did those things to you," he said. "Losing everything changed her in ways that I think surprised even her. She knows she can't undo what happened, but she's trying to become someone worthy of a second chance." Watching Rebecca during the wedding celebration, I could see evidence of the changes David was describing. She seemed more grounded, less frantic, more present in the moment rather than constantly calculating her next move. The woman who had once been obsessed with status symbols and get-rich-quick schemes was now wearing a simple dress from a thrift store and serving homemade cake to a room full of people who cared more about her happiness than her net worth. The transformation appeared genuine, but I remained cautious about what it meant for our relationship. People could change, but they could also revert to old patterns when circumstances shifted or stress increased. The real test of Rebecca's growth would come not during the honeymoon period of her new marriage, but during the inevitable challenges and conflicts that would arise in the years ahead. As I drove home from the wedding, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 4 years ago, I would have attended Rebecca's wedding out of obligation, probably would have paid for part of it, and certainly would have convinced myself that family harmony was worth more than personal boundaries. Today, I had attended by choice, as an observer rather than a participant, curious about Rebecca's growth but not responsible for it. The difference wasn't just in how I related to Rebecca, but in how I understood the entire concept of family. I had learned that blood relationships, like all relationships, needed to be earned and maintained through consistent behavior over time. They couldn't survive indefinitely on shared history and social expectations if they weren't supported by mutual respect and genuine affection. More importantly, I had learned that I could create chosen family relationships that were deeper and more satisfying than any biological connection I had ever experienced. Elena, Dr. Brennan, the friends from my writing group, the colleagues from my advocacy work. These people knew me authentically and cared about my well-being without any expectation of financial benefit or family obligation. 5 years after my resurrection, I published a memoir about my experience with family betrayal and recovery. The book wasn't a tell-all exposé designed to shame Rebecca and Marcus, but rather a thoughtful exploration of family dynamics, financial manipulation, and the process of rebuilding one's life after fundamental betrayal. I changed names and identifying details to protect everyone's privacy, but I was honest about the emotional journey and the lessons I had learned. The memoir found an audience among people who had experienced various forms of family trauma, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. It also sparked discussions about the societal pressures that keep people trapped in dysfunctional family relationships, out of misplaced loyalty or social expectations. One of the most rewarding aspects of publishing the book was hearing from readers who had found the courage to set boundaries with toxic family members, or leave abusive relationships after reading about my experience. Several people wrote to say that my story had helped them understand that they weren't obligated to maintain relationships with people who treated them poorly, regardless of blood connections or shared history. The book's success led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting requests from organizations that worked with survivors of family abuse. It also provided a platform for advocating for stronger legal protections and support services for people facing similar situations. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the sense of completion it provided. Writing the memoir had forced me to process every aspect of my experience, from the initial betrayal through the legal battles, to the ongoing work of rebuilding my life and relationships. It had transformed my trauma from something that had happened to me into something that could be useful to other people. Today, as I sit in my home office working on my next writing project, a novel about women who reinvent themselves after major life disruptions, I often think about the lessons that being declared dead taught me about truly living. The experience forced me to confront fundamental questions about what makes life meaningful, what kinds of relationships are worth maintaining, and what legacy I want to leave behind. I learned that being needed isn't the same as being valued, that financial generosity can't substitute for emotional boundaries, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their destructive behavior. I discovered that chosen family can be more nurturing than biological family, that meaningful work matters more than lucrative work, and that starting over at any age is possible if you're willing to let go of who you used to be. Most importantly, I learned that being declared dead had been, in many ways, exactly what I needed. It had given me permission to let go of relationships and obligations that were draining my spirit. It had forced me to rebuild my life according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. And it had taught me that the most authentic way to live is to choose, consciously and deliberately, what kind of person you want to be and what kind of life you want to create. The woman who walked into that courtroom 5 years ago had been legally dead, but spiritually alive in ways she had never experienced before. Today, I am both legally and authentically alive, surrounded by people who know and value the real me, engaged in work that reflects my deepest commitments, and grateful every day for the unexpected gift of getting to start over. Rebecca and I exchange holiday cards now, brief updates on our separate lives without any expectation of deeper connection. Marcus completed his community service and moved to another state, where he apparently found steady work and stopped trying to get rich quick. We have no contact, but I wish him well. The relationship I have with them now isn't the family bond I once thought I wanted, but it's honest in a way our previous relationships never were. There are no debts or obligations, no resentments or expectations, just the simple acknowledgement that we are people who share some history and wish each other no harm. It's not the ending I would have written for our family story 5 years ago, but it's the right ending for the person I've become. And every day, I'm grateful to be alive to write whatever comes next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.